In the summer of 1859, on the banks of the Ashley River just beyond Charleston, South Carolina, a woman named Clara took an axe to her master and his three sons during the Feast of St. James, carving into history one of the most savage acts of retribution the American South would ever attempt to silence. This is not a story of heroism, nor one of simple vengeance. It is a portrait of what happens when the machinery of human bondage grinds so mercilessly that the soul itself fractures and madness becomes the only language left to speak. You are listening to Shadows of the South, where we excavate the darkest, most deliberately forgotten chronicles of the slaveholding era, the stories that reveal not just what happened, but what we were capable of becoming. The Ashford plantation stretched across nearly 800 acres of prime low-country land, its fields thick with Sea Island cotton that grew tall and white under the Carolina sun. The main house rose 3 stories high, built in the Georgian style with broad verandas and columns that spoke of old money and older pride. Colonel Marcus Ashford, 52 years old in that fateful summer, was a third-generation planter, educated briefly at the College of Charleston before his father's death called him home to manage the estate. He was known throughout the district as a severe man, methodical in his business dealings, devout in his Episcopalian faith, and unyielding in his administration of discipline. He had inherited 147 enslaved souls from his father, and through calculated purchases at the Charleston markets, had expanded that number to 238 by 1859. His wife Abigail had died in childbirth 7 years prior, leaving him with 3 sons, Marcus Jr., age 24, Thomas 21, and William, barely 19. All 3 had been groomed to inherit portions of the estate, to perpetuate the Ashford name and the Ashford way of extracting wealth from human misery. Clara was born on the plantation in 1831, making her 28 years old when the events I am about to describe unfolded. Her mother, Dinah, had been a house servant, light-skinned and literate enough to read Bible passages aloud for the mistress. Clara inherited her mother's complexion and something of her intelligence, but she also inherited the particular curse that befell women who caught the master's attention. From the age of 15, Clara had been moved into the main house under the pretense of training as a seamstress and lady's maid. In truth, she became Colonel Ashford's concubine, a relationship he never acknowledged publicly, but pursued with the same methodical regularity he applied to his crop rotations. When Abigail Ashford was alive, the arrangement was conducted with discretion. After her death, discretion became unnecessary. Clara bore the colonel 2 children, both daughters, who were raised in the quarters with ambiguous status, too light to fully belong among the field hands, too black to ever be acknowledged by their father. By 1859, those girls were 9 and 7 years old, and Clara had learned to navigate her existence with a kind of watchful numbness, her face a mask that revealed nothing of the calculations occurring behind her eyes. The other enslaved people central to this narrative must be named, for they were witnesses, and in some cases, unwitting participants in what was to come. There was Solomon, 46, the head driver, a massive man with scars across his back that formed a topographical map of punishment, responsible for organizing the field gangs and maintaining order in the quarters. There was Patience, 33, the cook, who presided over the kitchen house with fierce competence and who had known Clara since childhood. There was young Abel, just 16, who worked in the stables and possessed an unusual gift for gentling horses, a sensitivity that extended to reading the moods of the people around him. There was Esther, 51, the midwife and herb woman, repository of African knowledge passed down through whispered instruction, the person enslaved people turned to when the white doctor's methods failed, or when certain problems required solutions the law would not permit. And there was Reverend Jacob, 62, a carpenter by trade, but an unlicensed preacher by calling, who conducted secret services in the woods on Sunday nights, blending Christianity with older practices, offering spiritual sustenance in a world designed to crush the spirit entirely. The events that would culminate in the St. James Massacre began, as such things often do, with a seemingly minor incident in early June. Marcus Jr., the eldest son, had recently returned from a buying trip to the interior markets. He brought back with him a young woman named Ruth, perhaps 17 years old, purchased from a failing plantation in the upcountry. Ruth was terrified, separated from her family, speaking little during her first weeks at Ashford Plantation. She was assigned to work under Clara's supervision in the house, learning the particular standards the Ashford men expected. What Marcus Jr. expected became clear within a fortnight. Ruth came to Clara one morning, her dress torn, her face swollen from crying, and the older woman understood immediately what had occurred. This was not unusual, this was in fact how the system functioned. But something in Ruth's devastation seemed to crack open a long-sealed chamber in Clara's heart. Perhaps it was seeing her younger self reflected in this girl's trauma. Perhaps it was the accumulation of years of her own violation finally reaching some critical mass. Whatever the mechanism, Clara began to change in ways that would only become apparent in retrospect. Pause for a moment and consider this. In a society where even one's own body was property, where resistance meant death and submission meant a different kind of death, what options existed for the preservation of one's humanity? The enslaved developed elaborate strategies of survival, but sometimes survival itself became unbearable, and the calculus shifted towards something else entirely. Throughout that sweltering June, Clara began making preparations, though she would later insist she did not fully understand what she was preparing for until the moment arrived. She befriended Ruth more deliberately, teaching her which parts of the house to avoid at which times, which routes through the mansion allowed for quickest escape from pursuing footsteps. She began spending more time with Esther, learning which herbs calmed the mind, and which accelerated the heart, which roots dulled pain, and which sharpened awareness to an unbearable degree. She asked Solomon about the tools kept in the plantation workshop, expressing interest in mending handles and sharpening blades under the guise of helping with household implements. Solomon, ever cautious, taught her what she asked, but he watched her with growing unease, sensing something he could not articulate. Abel, working in the stables, noticed that Clara had begun walking the grounds at night, pacing the perimeter of the main house like an animal learning its cage. When he mentioned this to Patience, the cook shook her head. "That woman carrying something heavy," Patience said. "Something gonna break loose, and when it do, won't be nothing we can do but get out the way." The Ashford men, meanwhile, continued their routines with the absolute certainty of those who had never questioned their right to them. Colonel Ashford rose each morning at 5, conducted his plantation business until noon, dined, then spent his afternoons reviewing accounts or riding out to inspect the fields. His sons divided the management responsibilities. Marcus Jr. handled sales and purchases, Thomas oversaw the cotton processing, and William, the youngest, was nominally in charge of provisions and supplies, though he showed more interest in hunting and drinking than in administrative duties. All three used the enslaved women of the plantation as they pleased, a privilege they considered as natural as breathing. The colonel himself still summoned Clara to his chambers 2 or 3 nights each week, and she went without protest, performing the required acts with mechanical compliance, her mind floating somewhere above her body, watching from a great distance. The feast of St. James fell on July 25 that year, a Monday. The Episcopal calendar marked it as a day of celebration for one of Christ's apostles, and Colonel Ashford, devout in his public displays of faith, always hosted a small gathering for neighboring planters and their families. The event was carefully choreographed, morning services at Christ Church, followed by an afternoon dinner at the plantation, then music and conversation extending into the evening. The enslaved population was expected to present the plantation at its finest, the house gleaming, the food abundant, the service invisible and perfect. Patience had been preparing for days, smoking hams, baking breads, preparing the dishes that would demonstrate Ashford prosperity. Clara had been assigned to oversee the serving, to ensure that glasses remained filled and plates replenished, to embody the fiction of gracious Southern hospitality built on a foundation of brutality. The morning of the feast dawned hot and still, the air thick with moisture that promised an evening storm. Clara rose before dawn, and went through her preparations with unusual care. She dressed in her finest clothing, a blue calico dress that had been a cast-off from the late Abigail Ashford. She wrapped her hair in a clean cloth. She looked at herself in the small mirror kept in her room, and saw a woman she barely recognized, someone who had made a decision without consciously making it, someone who had passed beyond fear into a territory that had no name. If you are finding these stories as unsettling and illuminating as we intend them to be, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South, because we will continue to excavate these buried truths, these narratives that reveal the full moral cost of the peculiar institution, regardless of how uncomfortable that revelation becomes. The church service proceeded as it always did, the white congregation seated in their family pews, while the enslaved population stood in the back gallery or outside the windows. Reverend Thompson delivered a sermon on apostolic devotion and the acceptance of one's station in life, a message that landed differently depending on where one stood in the church. Clara stood in the back, her hands folded, her face composed, listening to words about divine order and earthly suffering. When the congregation rose to sing, she sang, her voice blending with the others. When they prayed, she bowed her head, and when the service concluded, and the white families filed out to their carriages, she walked back to the plantation with the other house servants, silent and focused. The afternoon dinner was an elaborate affair, 12 guests in addition to the Ashford men, all seated around the long table in the dining room, while Clara and 2 other women served course after course. The conversation flowed around topics of cotton prices and political tensions, of secession talk, and the upcoming elections, of the natural inferiority of the African race, and the burden of civilizing Christian stewardship. These men spoke of enslaved people as investments and livestock, calculating depreciation and breeding potential with the same attention they gave to their horses. Colonel Ashford held forth on his theory of plantation management, emphasizing the importance of firm discipline tempered with paternalistic care, a philosophy that had produced both his wealth and the scars on Solomon's back. The guests nodded appreciatively, glasses raised in toast to Southern civilization. In such moments we must ask ourselves, how does a society convince itself that such monstrous arrangements are not only acceptable, but divinely ordained? The answer lies in elaborate systems of self-deception, in legal structures and religious interpretations, and pseudo-scientific theories, all designed to permit the conscience to rest easy while accumulating wealth through stolen labor and violated bodies. Clara moved through the room like a ghost, refilling wine glasses, removing plates, her face revealing nothing. But Abel, bringing in fresh pitchers from the kitchen, noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, and that she kept touching something in her apron pocket. Patience, arranging food on serving platters, saw Clara step outside briefly during the meal, saw her walk toward the tool shed and return minutes later, her apron hanging heavier than before. But the rhythm of service demanded constant motion, and there was no time to investigate, no time to ask questions that might have changed what followed. The dinner concluded near 6 o'clock, and the guests retired to the front veranda for brandy and cigars, while the enslaved staff cleared the table and began washing dishes. This was when the Ashford men typically relaxed their formal manners, when they loosened their collars and spoke more freely. The colonel and his sons stood together near the veranda railing, silhouetted against the evening light, discussing plans for the fall planting. The other guests had begun to depart, their carriages rolling down the oak-lined drive. A few lingered, but most were eager to reach home before the threatening storm arrived. By 7 o'clock, only the Ashford men remained on the veranda, along with one elderly neighbor, Judge Caldwell, who was deep in conversation with the colonel about a land boundary dispute. Clara emerged from the house, carrying a tray of fresh glasses. She walked with measured steps toward the group on the veranda. Later, those who survived would disagree about what happened next, about the exact sequence of events, but certain facts would remain undisputed. Clara set down the tray. She reached into her apron and withdrew not one but 2 implements, a large kitchen knife she had sharpened that morning, and a short-handled axe she had taken from the shed during dinner. Judge Caldwell saw her first and opened his mouth to speak, but whatever he intended to say was cut short by what he witnessed. Clara moved toward William first, the youngest, perhaps because he was closest, perhaps because he had forced himself on Ruth just the night before, perhaps for reasons only she understood. The axe came down once, twice, striking with a force born of accumulated years of rage, and William fell without a sound. Thomas turned at the commotion and received the blade in his chest before he could react. Clara dropping the axe to wield the knife with both hands, driving it upward with desperate strength. Marcus Jr. lunged toward her, but she was faster, smaller, propelled by something beyond rational thought. The knife found his throat, and he collapsed against the railing, his blood pooling on the white-painted boards. The colonel stood frozen for a critical second, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. Judge Caldwell was shouting, stumbling backward, nearly falling down the veranda steps. Inside the house, patients heard the commotion and rushed to the window, then immediately turned and shouted for everyone to run, to get to the quarters, to hide. Solomon was already moving, grabbing Abel and pushing him toward the woods, knowing with terrible certainty that what came next would be worse than what had just occurred. Clara turned to face Colonel Ashford, the knife still in her hand, her dress splattered with blood. For a moment, they stood looking at each other, this man who had owned her for 28 years, and this woman who had finally, catastrophically, refused to be owned any longer. The colonel's face showed not fear but incomprehension, as if the fundamental laws of reality had suddenly ceased to operate. Clara spoke then, the only words anyone would report hearing from her that evening: "You made me dead inside, so I'm making you dead outside." Then she came at him, and though he was larger and stronger, though he tried to defend himself, her assault was relentless. The axe, retrieved from where she had dropped it, rose and fell with mechanical repetition, and when Judge Caldwell finally fled to summon help, Clara was still striking the colonel's motionless body, each blow punctuating some internal litany only she could hear. Consider the mathematics of violence. The colonel and his sons had inflicted countless violations over years, each one a small murder of the spirit, none of them legally punishable, all of them socially sanctioned. Clara's violence lasted perhaps 5 minutes, and destroyed 4 lives. Which act was more monstrous? The question itself reveals the moral bankruptcy of a system that could even make such a question necessary. When Solomon finally approached the veranda, an hour later, summoned by his responsibilities as head driver, even as every instinct told him to run, he found Clara sitting on the steps, her hand still holding the axe, her eyes focused on something invisible in the distance. The bodies of the 4 Ashford men lay where they had fallen, the entire scene washed in the orange light of the setting sun. Solomon spoke to her softly, but she did not respond. He reached out slowly, and took the axe from her unresisting grip. She looked at him then and said, "I'm already gone. I was gone years ago." This just made it true. The authorities arrived near midnight, a group of white men on horseback, carrying torches and rifles, led by Judge Caldwell, and including the county sheriff, a handful of local planters, and several men known for their service on slave patrols. They found Clara exactly where Solomon had left her, unmoving, seemingly unaware of the storm that had finally broken and was soaking her to the skin. They shackled her immediately, though she offered no resistance. They searched the quarters, and found most of the enslaved population huddled in their cabins, terrified of the collective punishment that might follow. Solomon, knowing his position as head driver made him suspect, stepped forward and explained that Clara had acted alone, that no one else had knowledge of her intentions. The white men interrogated several others, particularly Patience and Esther, looking for evidence of conspiracy, but found none. This had been one woman's act, inexplicable to them, senseless, the action of a mind that must have been diseased or possessed. The trial, if it could be called that, occurred 2 days later in the Charleston courthouse. Clara was appointed no lawyer. She was permitted no testimony in her own defense. The evidence was considered overwhelming and undisputed. She had been caught at the scene, weapon in hand, with the bodies of her victims surrounding her. The prosecutor described her crime in lurid terms, speaking of ingratitude and savage nature, of the dangers of leniency and misguided compassion. He painted Colonel Ashford as a model of Christian slaveholding, a man who had provided for his slaves, had kept them fed and clothed and sheltered, who had maintained order without excessive cruelty. That Clara had been the colonel's concubine was mentioned only obliquely, as a sign of his unfortunate weakness for showing favoritism to one who had proven unworthy of such consideration. The jury, 12 white men of property, deliberated for less than 30 minutes. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within the week. But Charleston society, traumatized by the violence and terrified of its implications, demanded something more than a simple execution. There were whispers of making an example, of demonstrating what awaited those who dared raise their hands against the natural order. The sheriff, consulting with local planters and magistrates, decided that Clara would be hanged at Ashford Plantation itself, in sight of the enslaved population, who would be required to witness a public spectacle designed to burn into every mind present the consequences of rebellion. On August 2, 1859, 8 days after the St. James Massacre, nearly 300 people gathered at the plantation. The enslaved population of Ashford Estate, enslaved people brought from neighboring properties as witness, and a substantial crowd of white onlookers, who had traveled from Charleston to observe justice being served. Clara was led to the gallows that had been erected near the plantation entrance, a crude but functional structure built by Solomon and other men under armed guard. She walked without assistance, her face still wearing that distant expression she had assumed on the veranda steps. Reverend Thompson was there to offer final prayers, speaking about mercy and forgiveness, and the hope of salvation for even the most fallen souls. Clara looked at him, but said nothing. When asked if she had any final words, she turned her gaze to the assembled enslaved population, and spoke clearly. "I ain't sorry for what I done. I'm only sorry I didn't do it sooner." The white observers reacted with shock and anger to this lack of repentance. The enslaved witnesses stood in rigid silence, their faces carefully blank, but something passed through them, a recognition, a terrible understanding of what desperation could drive a person to become. The hanging was swift, and by the standards of such things, clean. Clara's body was left suspended for several hours as the crowd dispersed, and the enslaved population was marched back to work. Later that evening, Esther and Patience were permitted to cut her down and prepare her body for burial. They washed her carefully, dressed her in clean clothes, and wrapped her in a shroud. She was buried in the plantation cemetery in an unmarked grave, separate from both the white family plot and the section where enslaved people were typically interred, occupying a liminal space that reflected her liminal existence. The Ashford plantation did not recover from the massacre. With the colonel and all 3 sons dead, the estate fell into legal complications. Distant relatives emerged to claim inheritance, but the property had become notorious, touched by violence so extreme that it seemed to have poisoned the land itself. Enslaved people began to disappear, running away in increasing numbers, sensing that the shock of the murders had disrupted the normal mechanisms of control. The new owners, cousins from Virginia, who had never wanted to relocate to South Carolina, sold off the enslaved population within 6 months, scattering the community that had existed for generations. The plantation house itself stood empty for years, eventually burning under mysterious circumstances in 1864, whether from Confederate raiders, Union troops, or simple abandonment, no one could say for certain. We must pause here and acknowledge what Clara's actions reveal about the nature of enslavement itself. This was not a story of righteous resistance or heroic rebellion. This was a portrait of destruction, of what happens when human beings are pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Clara did not strike a blow for freedom. She struck a blow against her own unbearable existence. The tragedy is not just in what she did, but in what was done to her that made such violence seem like the only language available. Ruth, the young woman whose assault had perhaps triggered Clara's final psychological break, survived, and was eventually sold to a merchant in Savannah. She lived until 1892, working as a laundress after emancipation,
and near the end of her life, she spoke about Clara to her grandchildren. "She saved me," Ruth said, though in what sense remained unclear. "She showed me that we wasn't nothing to them, but we was something to ourselves. She proved we could say no, even if it cost everything." This interpretation of Clara's violence as a kind of tragic agency would persist in the oral histories of the scattered Ashford community, a complex legacy that resisted simple categorization as either heroism or horror. Clara's two daughters, aged 9 and 7 at the time of the massacre, were sold to different plantations and lost track of each other. Neither knew, for many years, what their mother had done or why. One of them, Mary, eventually made her way to Philadelphia during the war and lived there until 1901, working as a seamstress, just as her mother had once done. Late in life, she learned the full story of the St. James massacre and wept for days, not with shame, but with something more complicated, a grief mixed with understanding and a terrible pride that her mother had refused to die quietly. The other daughter, Eliza, remained in South Carolina and raised children of her own, never speaking about her parentage, taking the story with her to an unmarked grave in 1886. The Charleston area maintains no official memorial to Clara or to the massacre. The site of the Ashford plantation is now subdivided into residential lots, the fields where cotton once grew, covered with suburban houses and manicured lawns. Most residents have no knowledge of what occurred there in 1859. The historical record, such as it exists, lies scattered through court documents, newspaper archives, and estate inventories, the raw data of lives reduced to legal and financial transactions. But in the archives of the African American historical societies, in the collected oral histories and family narratives, Clara's story persists, told and retold, each telling adding new layers of interpretation while stripping away others. What can we learn from such a story, from this portrait of violence born of violation? The easy answer is that slavery was brutal and dehumanizing, that it created conditions where such horrors became inevitable. But that answer, while true, is insufficient. Clara's story forces us to confront something more uncomfortable, the way that systems of oppression do not just harm bodies, but warp souls, creating psychological landscapes where the normal calculus of right and wrong ceases to operate. Clara was not innocent in any conventional sense. She killed 4 men with her own hands, committed acts of shocking violence that cannot be excused or explained away. But neither was she simply guilty. She existed in a moral framework that slavery itself had shattered, where concepts like justice and retribution had been rendered meaningless by the daily operation of legal brutality. Take a final moment to reflect on this. The peculiar institution of American slavery did not just steal labor and destroy families, it created a moral void at the heart of Southern society, a vacuum where ordinary human empathy could not survive, where the categories we use to understand right and wrong became hopelessly confused. Clara's violence was not righteous, but neither was it incomprehensible. It was the logical endpoint of a system designed to break human beings into useful pieces, and the shock we feel at her actions should be directed not just at her but at the society that created the conditions for such violence to emerge. The story of Clara of Charleston, who took an axe to her master and his sons on the Feast of St. James in 1859, is not a story with a moral in the conventional sense. It offers no redemption, no triumph of the human spirit, no clear path forward. It is simply a portrait of destruction, of what slavery cost in terms of human souls and human possibilities. The men she killed were real people with families and futures, however complicit they were in the system that sustained them. Clara herself was destroyed long before she took up the axe, hollowed out by years of violation until only rage remained, and the community around them, enslaved and free, black and white, was damaged in ways that would echo through generations, trauma layered upon trauma, creating fault lines that still shape American society today. These stories, uncomfortable as they are, must be told. We cannot understand where we are without understanding where we came from, cannot grasp the depth of slavery's damage without looking at its most disturbing manifestations. The shadows of the South exist not in the past but in our present, in the silences and erasures that allow us to pretend that such things happened in a different world, to different people, with no connection to our own lives. But Charleston still stands, the Ashley River still flows, and somewhere under the subdivisions and shopping centers, Clara's unmarked grave reminds us that history is not safely contained in the past, but lives and breathes and demands recognition, no matter how much we might wish to look away. If these histories disturb you, as they should, I invite you to share this story, to help ensure that the silenced voices of the enslaved are finally heard, that the full accounting of slavery's cost is finally rendered, regardless of how painful that accounting might be.